tide is turning against Israel. What does that even mean, you may ask, given Israel has wiped Gaza from the face of the earth, exterminating countless numbers? It is prosecuting a relentless pogrom against the Palestinian people in the West Bank. It has devastated so much of southern Lebanon. It's occupying and attacking Syria with impunity. Well, we could go on. Let's see the latest evidence here in Britain. When we're discussing the tide turning against Israel and its genocide against the Palestinian people, we mean the establishment is beginning to turn, because the polling has consistently shown that the British people opposed Israel's onslaught from the start. 12 days after the 7th of October, 58% of British voters said there should be definitely an immediate ceasefire. Another 18% said there probably should, 5% said there probably shouldn't be a ceasefire, and 3% said there definitely should not be. That was the position of the British government, and it is the same number who incidentally think the earth is flat. Since then, polling has shown Brits think Israel is committing war crimes by a huge margin, as well as supporting a total arms embargo on Israel, and also majority support for the arrest of Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, it's important to note this because we're not giving the British establishment any kudos for playing catch-up with where the British people were at a very long time ago. Let's start by listening to Alistair Campbell. He's the former spin doctor to Tony Blair on his podcast with the former Tory MP Rory Stewart.
You see the pictures yesterday of people queuing for the limited food that was there, and it was children screaming and climbing over each other with these little pans to try and get some food into it. And I just feel that the international order has sort of given up. When was the last time we heard an international, like we have in Ukraine now, Macron Starmer come together, push Europe? When was the last time we had any sense of that happening? We had it a little bit when Trump came in, but it seems just to have faded away. I mean, I saw a picture yesterday of a young girl, who was holding her phone and showing a picture of herself a few months ago as a sort of lively, vibrant young girl. Now, ribs coming through the skin. Part of me feels that we've been too fair, actually, because we have constantly tried to put both sides. But I just think this is now beyond the pale. I think it's utterly unacceptable. And yet we seem to be accepting it.
It's an interesting concession here that Alistair Campbell believes they've been too fair on the podcast because he says they've constantly tried to put both sides. This both-sidism is, of course, a big part of the problem. It is the erasure of the dynamics at play. What are those dynamics? Well, it is Israel occupying Palestine, not the other way around. It is Israel which has repeatedly ethnically cleansed Palestinians, not least when Israel was founded in the first place. It is Israel which is stealing the land and colonizing the land of Palestinians in the West Bank. It is Israel which has always slaughtered by far the most people by a very big margin. It's Israel which has mass arrested and incarcerated so much of the Palestinian male population in particular, as well as subjecting them for decades to torture and sexual abuse. It is Israel which subjected Gaza to a protracted siege before the 7th of October. It is Israel which is armed to the teeth and backed by the world's only superpower and its Western allies. It is Israel which has wiped Gaza off the face of the earth. It is Israel which has subjected the West Bank to never-ending pogroms since the 7th of October, as well as unleashing hell against the Lebanese people and occupying Syria and repeatedly attacking it without any provocation. We could go on. There is the constant erasure of dynamics. So I hope Alistair Campbell has learned that lesson about dynamics, who has power and who does not. Now, Alistair Campbell draws attention to Israel's deliberate starvation of the Palestinian people. That intensified, of course, with the total siege imposed from the beginning of March, but it has been a recurring feature of Israeli policy since the 7th of October. Indeed, it represents the core of the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court against Netanyahu and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant last year. Now look, we need people with power and influence to shift their positions if we're going to stop this genocide. But you do have to ask yourself, how has it taken 19 months of daily depravity for you to get to this point? Mass slaughters of innocent people every single day, including kids, toddlers, babies, mass maiming, mass destruction of almost all civilian infrastructure, up to including hospitals, the industrialized torture, sexual abuse, rape, the overtly, unashamedly genocidal rhetoric of Israeli leaders and officials, which has been never-ending since 7th of October. How did you not see all of that? How is it only now you can clearly understand that this is beyond the pale? I'd love to hear the answer. Next, the Independent newspaper, which has an editorial entitled "The Deafening Silence in Gaza, It Is Time to Speak Up." Oh, now it's time to speak up. Now it's time to speak up. oh, I'm glad there wasn't any pressure for that to happen earlier. It's now 19 months in. That's when it's time to speak up. Now, at the start of the genocide, the Independent supported Israel's onslaught despite empty hand-wringing about the need to abide by international law, which the Independent must have known, if they're not completely thick, where that Israeli leaders and officials had no intention of doing so because they made clear from the start with their statements they had no intention of doing so. So it's just asking for something, hand-wringing about something you know isn't going to happen. So that, in order for you to justify backing what is obviously a criminal enterprise. Because what you do is you ask for something you know isn't possible, but you go, well, I did ask for them to not do the things which you must have known they were going to do anyway. And therefore you think you keep your integrity. Doesn't work like that, guys. The editorial at the time, when they backed the onslaught, was frankly vile. They said the imposition of a complete siege in Gaza by the Israel Defense Forces should assist in focusing minds in the region and far beyond. It will be harsh, but as Mr. Netanyahu might point out, this is war. I beg your fucking pardon. Netanyahu could say what he wants, but imposing a complete siege on a civilian population is a violation of international law. It is a war crime. It's not something that's just part of war. It's not like, oh, well, we'll just starve the whole population. But, as Netanyahu says, what do you expect? It's war. This part becomes particularly relevant when I get to the new Independent editorial, which speaks about how we need to end the silence. Now, at the time, they went on, whatever path Israeli policy follows in the coming days, it should avoid measures that will erode world sympathy for a nation under a barbaric attack. There was no justification for it. But as a civilized nation and a democracy, Israel should keep to the international conventions of war. Okay, so abiding by international law becomes about a PR exercise for Israel there, rather than, protecting civilians as an end in its own right. Do you think Palestinians are humans? Where's the evidence in this editorial? I can't see any evidence, which is why we ended up in the catastrophe you're now hand-wringing about. I mean, what you did there is whitewash Israel's past, which is a litany of war crimes, trying to present an ethno-state which was subjecting the Palestinian people in the West Bank to a barbaric, brutal occupation for which the Palestinian people there do not consent to. How can you call that a democracy? How can you just pretend that Israel is just some other democracy when it is illegally occupying another people and relentlessly inflicting war crimes against them? Now, the Independent went on, Israel has the right to defend itself and treat this as an aggressive war. Again, those who wrote the editorial must have known the battery of genocidal statements issued by the Israeli state at the start. What they did, by the way, in the editorial is say, treat this as an aggressive war, because what they were doing is starting the clock on the 7th of October. They were pretending as though Israel was just living in peace and then they just got attacked out of nowhere, as if there wasn't mass murder of the Palestinians taking place literally in the months leading up to what happened. In any case, they made clear with their genocidal statements at the beginning, which the Independent in many cases didn't bother to even print, because it would have revealed what Israel was doing. And if they had to report accurately what Israel said they were doing, then it would have been very hard for them to keep this position, wouldn't it? So they just lied to their readership, because lying by omission is a lie. I mean, did they think these statements were just, letting off steam? If so, quite a disastrous miscalculation on your part, Independent, a newspaper I used to be employed by the way, given those statements proved entirely accurate predictors of what Israel would do. In fact, the most accurate roadmap to what Israel would go on to do. Now, the editorial then went on to say Iran was the real problem in the Middle East, and then went on to emphasize the deep trauma in Israeli society without any reference to the deep traumas of Palestinian society. Now, let's get to the latest editorial. The Independent begins by discussing the war crimes committed on 7th October, adding, despite its fierce retaliation raising immediate alarm, Israel found international backing for the right to defend itself. Now, clearly the Independent there is trying to cover its own backside to justify what it supported. They then go on, but now any initial moral justification for continuing to prosecute the war 18 months on has been lost, and the disgust we once reserved for Hamas militants transferred to the brutal and relentless assaults by the Israel Defense Forces and the humanitarian disaster caused by its blockade. Well, it's 19 months. It'd be helpful to be able to count, especially given you're now talking about the timing of when we're supposed to speak out or not. Can I ask the Independent a polite but firm question? Are you honestly saying it's only now, after 19 months, that you believe what you call the initial moral justification has been lost for this onslaught? Is only now the disgust you say you felt on the 7th of October has transferred to the Israel Defense Forces. 19 months of atrocities being committed against civilians every single day, every possible war crime under the sun. And it's only now you believe things have changed. Seriously. Are we supposed to take you seriously as a newspaper? I mean, I doubt you'll exist in 5 years' time, but seriously. With the requests for arrest warrants issued by the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court a year ago, not a clue. All the genocide scholars who've been warning about genocide from the very beginning, let alone, well, I mean, let's not get pernickety, but the actual total destruction of Gaza and the mass slaughter of its people. No? Okay. The editorial goes on to discuss the impact on Palestinians using the official death toll, which is a severe underestimate, which they should know and note. And they also note the Palestinians living in Gaza have always been little more than collateral damage. Okay, hold on a minute. Okay, if that's always been true, if contempt for Palestinian civilian life has been obvious all the way through, then why is it not obvious enough for the Independent to write this editorial any sooner about the need to break silence, as you put it? Now, they go on to say that, shockingly, the response from the international community to Netanyahu's resumption of the onslaught was muted, and that Israel's allies, including the UK, should have spoken out against this counterproductive and literally aimless move, as well as the devastating humanitarian catastrophe that caused. It's not aimless, though, is it? I mean, they're openly talking about removing every last Palestinian from Gaza. They want them gone. And that means either they all die or they flee. They flee or they die. So how is it? It's not aimless, is it? It's not aimless. They're openly talking about their aims. They're openly saying, Netanyahu and his ministers, that they want all the Palestinians of Gaza gone. They've made that clear. It's not aimless. The silence from the UK and others has been deafening, the UK note, the newspaper notes. And Sir Keir Starmer should be ashamed that he said nothing. Well, I agree. I mean, he should be ashamed. Good luck on that one. I mean, the fact is, Keir Starmer backed the onslaught at the beginning. He backed what he called Israel's right to inflict a siege against the Palestinian people, trying to gaslight everyone afterwards that he didn't actually support what he actually said he did. And he's still now, he's not just silent, they're giving the components, the crucial components to Israel for the F-35 jets to keep raining death and destruction on the people of Gaza. It's not just he's saying nothing, he's actually doing things actively which are killing people. Now, the Independent, which backed the onslaught at Nowruz, states, it is time for the world to wake up to what is happening and to demand an end to the suffering of the Palestinians trapped in the enclave. Some people may want to turn away, unable to comprehend the levels of starvation, misery, and hopelessness. I mean, lots of us, well, enough of us, not people with a platform in the media, don't get me wrong. I mean, your hands are soaked in blood, you lot. But some of us actually did refuse to turn away from the beginning. Now, they then go on to advertise their own coverage, adding, now is not the time to avert our eyes. Quite a lot of fun, haven't we, lads? Quite a lot of fun. As you mourn the inevitable and predictable and predicted consequences of what you supported, then you take 19 months and start adopting a moral high ground and finger wagging about averting our eyes now, long after Gaza was reduced to nothing, almost. Now, some of us have been saying don't look away for a very long time, precisely because people like you did look away and in the process helped to facilitate genocide. That's the problem. That's why we're in the current situation. Now, they say, but Mr. Netanyahu's vow to destroy Hamas was never a realistic war aim, and it morphed into the destruction of Gaza. Morphed. Are you taking the piss? According to Air Wars, an NGO of experts, the first month of Israel's campaign was, to quote, by far the most intense, destructive, and fatal conflict for civilians that Air Wars has ever documented. Within weeks, Gaza was a different colour and texture when looked at from space. They are revising history in order to protect themselves. What they're trying to do is suggest that the onslaught they supported evolved into something different, which they would never have supported if they'd known. This is based on a lie. These are all lies. There's no contrition here, but lots of implicit arse covering. Arse covering from a newspaper, which I'm afraid is complicit in Israel's genocide. You backed it. You think it doesn't count because you did hand-wringing about it. The hand-wringing is not relevant. The hand-wringing was actually just to sow illusions. It's even worse. By hand-wringing it and saying, well, Israel should abide by international law when they made clear they didn't, you were therefore deflecting from the fact they'd made clear that they weren't going to do any such thing and then didn't. It's even worse. Now, The Economist is another publication which backs this onslaught. They now estimate that up to 109,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed by violence alone. That's not including the deaths by indirect causes, destruction of healthcare, hunger, lack of fresh water, lack of shelter. We could go on. And all the research suggests that it's indirect causes, which will be the far bigger cause of death. Then there's the Times newspaper, which has been a zealous supporter of Israel's onslaught, which has published a column by the former Tory MP Matthew Parris headlined, "Why are we closing our eyes to Gaza's horror?" Who do you mean by we? That's to the Times sub-editor who wrote that. The Times, he wouldn't have written the headline. Columnists don't, just so you know. It is a devastating column, incidentally, more devastating than that printed by many liberal newspapers. It begins, "Why does the world look away? Are we simply bored, or do we flinch from the wreckage, the famine and the blood in Gaza?" Well, I would politely suggest it's because Israel is a Western ally, which is armed and backed to the teeth by the West, including the British government, that its people are seen as us and Palestinians are them, as unpeople, not really human at all, and that the Western governments and media outlets who facilitated this abomination from day one aren't awfully keen on de facto admitting their culpability at this point. That is just a wild guess on my part. Now, he goes on to say, Matthew Parris, this is 2025. As we speak, 2 million human beings face starvation at the hands of our close ally, Israel. As we speak, all hell is being rained down now. Yes, he notes the atrocities mount, and it's been dropped from the headlines. He should note that's because of the editorial decisions of people who run media outlets. He doesn't say that. He goes on to say, we British continue to supply military kit, share intelligence and more. Why? What indeed? And if you think hard enough, you're going to come, I would say, to some pretty disturbing conclusions about the nature of British and Western foreign policy as a whole, aren't you? Because why are we continuing to facilitate a genocide? He doesn't use the word genocide in the piece, unfortunately, but it is a genocide. I mean, he's accepted it's a grave crime. So what now? I mean, if you accept a crime as grave as the one you're talking about, then you think the government are criminally complicit. Wouldn't make any sense otherwise. He writes an important paragraph here. It's customary at this point in a column about Gaza to insert a carefully outraged paragraph about Hamas's unprovoked incursion into Israel on October 7th and the slaughter and kidnapping that ensued. Take that as read, but I'm sick of whataboutery. What indeed about October 7th? What about Sudan? What about Ukraine? As though further horrors can diminish a horror staring us in the face. Well, indeed, those playing this game, and it is a game, are only doing so to deflect responsibility for this heinous crime, which they are guilty of. As he discusses, Matthew Parris, the horrors being inflicted, he implores, what further savagery must be inflicted before we, Israel's Western allies, say enough and mean it? But this is the really important paragraph. Every age looks back at previous ones, aghast at things that happened on the watch of our fathers or forefathers, complicit by their silence. How is this going to look? How are our successors going to feel when one day British children are taught at school that in their own century, their own countrymen averted their eyes while Palestinians faced a rain of missiles and bombs with many tens of thousands dying in the assaults? Well, I think this speaks a little to what's currently happening at the moment. It is obviously now becoming very clear to all but the fanatical and delusional that this is going to go down in history as one of the great crimes. And those who either supported it or were in positions of power and influence and refused to call it out for what it is, despite the overwhelming and incontrovertible evidence staring at them in the face, are beginning to panic. They're starting to panic because they fear they may actually be remembered as monsters. And they're right to panic, especially if they're politicians who arm this abomination, because I've no doubt at all, and some of you, those politicians, you're going to go to jail for what you've done. And the careers of journalists are going to end over this. There's going to be a reckoning because the crime really is too big, too extreme, too shameless, too documented. The fact some of those with power and influence are suddenly turning against Israel, some of those who refuse to call this crime what it obviously was from the start, which was predictable and indeed predicted, well, that's instructive, isn't it? We can see some of those with power and influence, yes, suddenly turning against Israel. That's what's currently going on. Some of those who refuse to call this crime what it obviously was from the start. And here's the key point. It was predictable and indeed predicted what has happened. In October 2023, I wrote a Guardian column headlined, Israel is clear about its intentions in Gaza. World leaders cannot plead ignorance of what is coming. The subheading was, the UN is warning of a risk of genocide against Palestinians. Future pleas, or if I knew then what I know now, will not cut it. I wrote this column for a very straightforward reason. I wanted to record the fact that it was very clear what Israel was going to do to Gaza from the very beginning. I wanted to make it clear that there was no excuses for not knowing from the very beginning. I wanted to preempt attempts by those who were culpable to revise history. Noting what happened with Iraq, where there wasn't a reckoning, I wrote, As the calamity of Israel's onslaught against Gaza becomes apparent, those who cheered it on will panic about reputational damage and plead their earlier ignorance. Do not let them get away with it this time. I gave examples of genocidal and criminal statements made by Israeli leaders and officials, as well as crimes being committed, like a siege and indiscriminate bombing. And I noted the warnings of genocide being discussed at the time by UN experts, warned about by UN experts. As I've said over and over again, no crime in history has been so confessed to as it happened. No crime in history has been so documented as it happened. As I wrote in that column, nobody with power and influence can be allowed to claim ignorance. Yes, we do need those with power and influence to turn against Israel and its genocidal depravity, because we need that depravity to end. We need to save lives. We also need a reckoning. Our failure to have that reckoning over the Iraq war is part of the reason this catastrophe has been allowed to happen, because we failed to send politicians to jail. We failed to end the careers of journalists who use their platforms to build consent and acquiescence for a terrible crime. If there isn't a reckoning this time round, then we will pave the way for ever greater horrors to come. Here's a prediction as well. I've said throughout, they're never going to forgive us for being right about Gaza. Were those who were proven horribly right about Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya then treated with respect, as though maybe they're people who understand what they're talking about, compared to those who supported those wars? No. If anything, they ended up more vilified and demonized than ever before. In the age of McCarthyism, which is relevant because we're in the midst of the biggest assault on free speech since then, there was this horribly Orwellian term used by the McCarthyites: premature anti-fascists. If you were one of the early siren voices speaking out against fascism, then you were deemed likely to be a communist. And so they will make a distinction between themselves, who took over a year and a half to see what Israel was clearly doing all along, and those who called it for what it was too early, clearly a mark of extremism. Well, the real extremists were those who backed what was always clearly a grave crime from day one. This time, there's got to be accountability. Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts in your comments. Help us to take on this. Well, we can see what this media is, can't you? At patreon.com/OwenJones84. Listen to us on the podcast. Share the video. I'll speak to you soon.